being let in, I want to say good afternoon. So I'm Tovim, Erev Tov, to those joining us from Israel. Good evening. Thank you so much for making time in your day to join us and to do some learning together. I'm Rabbi Josh Weinberg, and I serve as the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the Union for Reform Judaism. It's a bit of a mouthful. And I deal with all things Israel for the Reform Movement. And it is a distinct honor to be able to partner with our friends at the Israel Policy Forum. And we're joined today, of course, by their Executive Director, David Halpern, Dr. Michael Kaplow, and all the way from Israel, from the Jerusalem Post, Lahav Harkov. And we'll share their bios in just a few minutes. This is the first webinar, the first session of a 5-part series that we'll be embarking on together. So, buckle up and join us for this journey where we explore the state of two states, looking at the issues, challenges, and opportunities for how we arrive at a two-state for two people arrangement. Whether that is going to be an end-all solution or not, we don't know yet, and we're not quite sure yet how to get there. But of course, the question of where this all ends, where this conflict comes to a final status arrangement, is the question that many of us have been asking and working closely to try and achieve, whether we're in the US, in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, or around the world. Much focus is here, including recently bills and proposed legislation coming through the United States Congress that also deal with this. And we wanted to be able to shed light and give as much background as possible so we can really do a deep dive and understand all of the issues that are surrounding these big questions. Today's session, of course, is going to deal specifically with the relationship between the United States and Israel, whether it's government to government, diplomatic relations, or even people to people. And I'm looking forward to that. Going forward, we're going to be looking at the Israeli-Palestinian relationships, what's going on in Palestinian civil society, the question of normalization, the question of those territories beyond the Green Line, whether you call them the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, anything else. These are all topics that are going to be covered. And if you, hopefully you can register for all 5 webinars soon, and they'll of course be recorded. Again, my deep thanks to, of course, to Sierra DeCrosta and Molly Blumenthal from our respective teams. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to David Halpern to begin our session and get us started.
So thanks so much, Josh, and thanks everyone for joining us. I want to first start, thank you, Lahav, for joining, and Michael as well. I think we should just start off by taking a 30,000-foot view of this question. We're starting a series on the state of two states, and we're having a conversation today about the state of the U.S.-Israel dynamic in that question about the state of two states with a completely different political situation than we had just a year ago, from a Trump administration to the Biden, and of course from a Netanyahu-led government for much of a decade to a rather unique political alliance today. So I want to start with getting a perspective first from Lahav and then from Michael on what's different from a year ago, and maybe what's still the same, both from the Israeli side and from the American side, particularly as relates to this question of the future of a two-state solution. Let's start with you, Lahav.
Oh, I mean, if we look back a year ago, or maybe a year and a month ago, because we're already in the middle of November, I think the U.S.-Israel relationship in some ways was very simple and clear cut. I mean, you might be happy or less happy with the way it was, but it was sort of this easy thing. Netanyahu and Trump were, buddies. And the Trump administration barely did anything that had to do with Israel that, that Netanyahu wasn't completely on board with and aware of, and they were really just working completely together. And again, you could like what they did with that work or not, but the relationship was pretty clear. Now it's more complicated, and I would say more normal, more similar to what it was over the years. The Biden administration is supportive of Israel, views Israel, of course, as a key ally in the Middle East, but has its caveats and has its criticisms. Now, first Netanyahu was prime minister, and there was some level of you could say awkwardness. On the one hand, Biden and Netanyahu, although probably more so Netanyahu, emphasized that they had known each other for 40 years. They called each other good friends, but more behind the scenes, they disagreed on practically everything. Netanyahu was continuing on his sort of harder line on Iran. Didn't even want to talk to the Biden administration about Iran because he felt even talking to them about it would legitimize a return to the JCPOA, which is the 2015 nuclear deal, which Israel strongly opposes. And when it came to Palestinian issues, Netanyahu continued with his sort of status quo, and he wanted the Trump peace plan. He viewed the Trump peace plan as sort of a precedent that he wasn't going to back down from. Now we have a new government who, the Biden administration doesn't really know the people leading this government at all. There's only one prime minister, it's Naftali Bennett, but in a way, this government has two parts, which is the more right-wing Bennett part and the center to left-wing Lapid part. And Lapid and Bennett both came into politics in the 2013, or national politics, at least in the 2013 election. But they never reached as senior roles as they're in now, with Bennett being prime minister and Lapid being foreign minister. And Lapid was briefly opposition leader, and so he did meet. He had met Vice President Kamala Harris when she was a senator, but I don't think either of them had met Biden. Bennett certainly had not. And it was a fresh page, so to speak. But on the other hand, Bennett actually shares a lot of Netanyahu's views on just about everything. Right. So it took a little while for this government to settle in and to figure out how it's going to work with these almost sort of a two-headed government. But it meant that sort of Bennett had to, if not moderate his views, then moderate his goals and how he's going to act on them. And the same went for the other side. And so on the big issues, there's a almost consensus in the Israeli government that the Iran deal was not great, but there wasn't consensus on how to deal with it, for example, on whether we should be just like figuring out a way to live with it and make the best of it, or to continue to vocally protest in the way Netanyahu did, right? And so this government in the end sort of fell on we're going to try to work as closely with the Biden administration as possible to make the best of the situation, because they realized, if Netanyahu made the biggest stink you could possibly make and it didn't do anything, then they didn't think that they'd be able to really change anything in that way. When it comes to a two-state solution, which is our topic here, Lapid supports a two-state solution, but is sort of in the camp of people who thinks that it's probably not going to happen so fast. The Palestinian leadership at the moment is not really amenable to it. And Bennett very strongly opposes a two-state solution, always has. He's in favor of annexation, at least of the settlements, if not all the entire West Bank. And so they came to this sort of compromise whereby they're not going to withdraw from any territory and they're not going to annex any territory. And the pace of construction and settlements is supposed to continue sort of natural growth plus. It's not going to be like a crazy amount of building, but it will be, a bit. More than a bit, I would say, really, if we're being honest. I mean, they've already announced thousands of homes, but in existing settlements, of course, they're not talking about building new ones. In any case, the Biden administration, I think, is working well with this government in some ways, but it's just very complicated. Like I had said that it was so clear and obvious what the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump was. In this case, every little step, every little thing that each side does, there's like a question mark hovering over it. And so, with the settlements, the Biden administration is criticizing, but what are they going to do with that criticism, right? How far are they going to take it? What kind of words are they going to use in diplomacy? Every little word counts. Are they condemning it? Are they concerned? Are they, these mean different things. When it comes to Iran, they're actually constantly talking to Israel about it and publicly talking to Israel about it, because I think that's sort of important, both in the U.S. and in Israel, to show that they're working together. So it's sort of this agree to disagree situation on a lot of things where they want to keep the relationship positive and good, even though they realize that there are a lot of points of tension. So they're trying to keep the tension as low as possible and as quiet as possible, and to discuss things behind closed doors. So there's definitely a big shift between now and a year ago in that way. From, two people who, are constantly praising each other and completely in line with each other, to two sides that are trying to show I don't know if a brave face is the right word, but they're trying to show a united front, whereas we know behind the scenes there are all kinds of rumblings.
I think that's a great way of sort of setting the table. We want to unpack a lot of kind of what you touched on,
Yeah.
Israeli policy and settlements and the like. But Michael, I want to turn to you to have a variation of your take on the same question. But it's not only kind of what's different than in the Trump era, but what are some of the new dynamics that we should be paying attention to in Washington around this question of the U.S. role in a region where it increasingly appears that the United States has finally made this long called for pivot to Asia, that it's not prioritizing the Middle East. Is that accurate? And what are some of the new dynamics in Washington that we should be thinking about it in terms of these questions right now?
Sure. So I agree with pretty much everything Lahav said, and I'll add a few I'll add a few pieces on top of it from the American side. So absolutely, the shift from the personal dynamic of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett is a big one. But I think that from the American side, one of the big things that is different is that, leaving aside the personalities and even leaving aside the agreements on specific areas of policy that characterize the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, under President Trump, there was in some ways an almost singular focus on Israel, in a variety of ways. Israel and Israel issues, I think, were in a lot of ways at the center of Trump's certainly regional policy and in a lot of ways foreign policy writ large. It started with recognition of Jerusalem and how Trump was going to handle the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and kind of ended with normalization, which I think ended up being the big, bright, shining star of the Trump foreign policy. And so much of what President Trump talked about and focused on was Israel or Israel adjacent. And in the Biden administration, that really intense focus on Israel is for the most part gone. President Biden and a lot of the folks around him, you alluded, David, to the pivot to Asia that we're always waiting for. I'm not sure if we've seen it fully, but there's no question that this administration really doesn't want to focus on the Middle East unless they absolutely have to. And within the context of the Middle East, Israel and Israel issues are not at the top of that list. So, for starters, generally there has been, I think, not a downgrading of the relationship with Israel, but certainly a downgrade in terms of the focus it gets. Another way in which this administration is unique is that I think it's accurate to say that certainly every president dating back to President Clinton, and maybe even arguably dating back to George H.W. Bush, believed that there was a chance that they would oversee a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, some sort of permanent status agreement, which over time evolved into the notion of a two-state solution. This administration does not believe that. This administration, and I say unique because I think it is unique, does not think that the resolution, that the conflict is ripe for resolution, does not think that they should really be deeply involved in trying to get the two parties to a permanent status agreement. And so even when you put aside the fact that there's less of a focus on Israel itself and Israel as an issue, in the context of two states, the Biden administration just doesn't think it's going to happen under its tenure. And so as opposed to President Obama, who was famously skeptical, certainly in his second term, that it could happen, but was willing to give willing to sort of give some slack in the rope to Secretary Kerry to try to pursue it. That's not happening in this administration. It may happen at some point, but certainly there are no signs of it now. And I think that that leads to a lot of what Lahav talked about in terms of things are not as clear. There's a lot more ambiguity, and part of that is because I think we all have a sense of what the Biden administration generally opposes and generally supports and generally wants to see happen. The question is really what, what priorities are going to be placed on it and how hard they're going to push. And so, when it comes to something like Israeli construction in the West Bank, so, it's pretty clear that the administration views construction in the West Bank as generally unhelpful. But I don't think anybody has a good sense really of how hard the administration will push back against it. If it depends on whether it happens in certain places versus other places, if it depends on whether there are going to be corresponding moves toward the Palestinians. Something that Defense Minister Gantz made a big deal of was that when 2,800 new units were approved for Israeli communities in the West Bank, the next week the committee met to approve somewhere over 1,000 units for Palestinians in Area C. Few of those were actually final approvals, but the point was if we're going to build in the West Bank for Israelis, we're also going to grant permits to Palestinians. And I think there's an open question as to whether that approach is going to mollify the administration or not. And so things were certainly a lot more clear a year ago than they are now. And I think especially now that we have Mike Herzog, who started 2 days ago officially as Israeli ambassador to Washington, and we have Tom Nides, who next week is leaving the United States to assume his post as U.S. ambassador in Jerusalem. I think that we're probably going to start. Some of these questions are going to come to a bit more of a head, and I think we're probably going to start to have a little more clarity on exactly what the red lines are for the Biden administration, if any, and what issues they're going to make a bigger deal out of. And on things like construction, we're reopening the consulate, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. I think that we're probably going to start to have a better bit of a sense in the next few weeks and months than we have had up until this point as to really just how much the administration cares about any of these things, right, and to what extent they're going to push on them.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I want to acknowledge, obviously, that in this wider conversation, we're focusing on the U.S. Israel. I know that as part of this series, we're going to dig deeper into the Palestinian side. But I think you mentioned the consulate. I think as we get to that issue in terms of the hot buttons to come, I think it might be useful to just do a little bit of a deeper dive. If we started from a 30,000-foot view, to kind of look at the internal politics on both the Israeli and the American side as relates to this question of two states. And Lahav, I'm kind of curious if you could give us a sense, now that the budget is passed in Israel, one could view from afar that the Palestinian issue is the lightning rod not to be touched, so as to upend this delicate balance of this bizarre coalition from the left to the right. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how this plays itself out going forward. In other words, we have building in the West Bank, but we have Meretz and Labor in the coalition, right? At what point do Meretz and Labor say absolutely not? And on the other side, on the right-leaning side, we have this growing tension of various MKs going to meet with Abbas. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the internal politics of the Palestinian issue and the tensions that it could create on this coalition.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like the coalition can say as much as it wants that it's just not going to do anything or change anything on the Palestinian issue. Reality gets in the way. It's not even Netanyahu, who was Mr. Status Quo. He had to do things and say things sometimes that have to do with the Palestinians because they're there. Sometimes they get very angry at Israelis, to say the least, and so things happen. And how the government will respond to those things. I mean, I hope that there won't be another war anytime soon, but you really never know. especially when it comes to Gaza. When it comes to things like settlements or people meeting with Abbas, or today there was the ad hoc liaison committee, which is the committee of donor states to the Palestinian Authority. Israel went and asked countries to donate to the Palestinian Authority, which it has always traditionally done, including under Netanyahu, because the Palestinian Authority is viewed as a stabilizing force. But even that is sort of a weird internal contradiction, because Israel has this policy. Well, we back up. The Palestinian Authority has a policy where if a terrorist is in prison, or if the terrorist is killed, then he and his family, or she, gets a monthly stipend from the Palestinian Authority that is well above the average salary, that a Palestinian makes. So, the Palestinians say it's welfare payments, but the World Bank, for example, wrote in a report, like, it's very clearly not welfare, it's not targeted at poor people, and it's a lot higher than, like, typical wages for Palestinians. So Israel passed a law in 2018 to deduct the amount of money that the Palestinians pay terrorists from the taxes and tariffs that Israel collects for the Palestinians because of the Oslo Accords. And they basically freeze that money. They can't do anything with it, but they're not giving it to the Palestinians. Now, on the one hand, Israel is saying the Palestinians pay terrorists, so they can't have their own money. Really, it's taxes that go to the Palestinian Authority. On the other hand, they're going to Oslo to ask countries to pay the Palestinians. And this law was proposed by a Knesset member who is now the intelligence minister in this government. And he's not even on the right-wing side of this government. He's in Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, which is center to center left. So that just, today's event sort of exemplifies this weird contradiction and inconsistency about how Israel looks at things. And so when it comes to the Palestinian issue, there's already been points of tension, whether it's Gantz approving thousands of homes for settlers, or just there was this whole thing with the outposts of legalizing an outpost that happened like almost immediately after this government was formed, an agreement that the outpost will be dismantled, but they'll build the yeshiva there. Meretz is very upset about this. And so these are things that have to be dealt with all the time. And the question is, at what point will this government decide that keeping Bibi out of power is enough to unite them, and they'll all just like sort of bite their tongues while things they don't like happens? On the right, there are things that are, for the right, there are also things that are happening that they don't like. I don't think the meetings with Mahmoud Abbas are such a big problem. Yeah, I mean, they made a couple of comments, but I don't think those meetings are the problem per se. I actually think a lot of the problems are the demands that the Ra'am party, the Islamist party in the coalition, is making. In recent years, I don't know how much this like got out of Israel, like how much, I mean, we reported on the Jerusalem Post, but I don't know that it's something that people were trying to search outside of Israel. But the Bedouins in the Negev, they want like their encampments to be legalized, and they want it to be exactly where they are at this. I mean, whatever, how they've been there for a while, but they want to be exactly those places. The government says, no, we want to do this in a more organized way and build towns the way we normally build towns. And basically the Ra'am's voter base is very heavily Bedouin. The right wing is not for just saying, okay, you illegally squatted on this land for 20 years, but now let's give it to you. I mean, that's how they see it. That's if they were to legalize it on campus. So that's actually a really big thing that's being discussed now, and is causing tension in the coalition, how to deal with the Bedouins. For Ra'am, it's like do or die, like these are their voters. And for the right, it's again a land issue and a sovereignty issue, not even in the West Bank, it's in sovereign, it's in 1948 Israel, not 1967 Israel. So these are definitely things we're going to have to look at going forward, and it's hard to say what exactly the breaking point will be and when it'll be.
Right, and I think you mentioned that part of the breaking point is deciding what's the cost of potentially bringing Bibi back by going to another election that could bring this down. And in some cases, Michael, that's the same question about how the U.S., how far the U.S. wants to push on the Israeli-Palestinian arena. That this question of will they push the Israelis towards a collapse of the government. But I wondered if you could touch on that question, right? Of does the U.S. actually want to engage? You mentioned there's a question about its priorities. Clearly, the U.S. is not interested in seeing a return of Bibi Netanyahu, or it seems that way. But I wonder if you could also talk a bit, Michael, about just the state of our politics in Washington and how it impacts how the Biden administration thinks about this issue, with increasing divisions between Democrats and Republicans and increasing divisions within the Democratic Party itself on these questions.
On the issue of the return of Bibi Netanyahu, so this is something that you hear from administration officials and members of Congress and their staffs a lot. People are very consumed with the question of what if anything will bring down the Israeli government, and there are all sorts of there are questions about this on all sorts of issues. Will reopening the consulate bring down the government? Is Ayelet Shaked gonna bolt over the consulate issue? Is it going to be pushing the Israeli government on settlements? Even things like the visa waiver process. Does that have to kind of be advanced to keep some of the members of the coalition happy? So it's definitely something that people in Washington are very focused on, and the fact that I think that in Israel, as Lahav just demonstrated, nobody has an absolute sure sense about what will the breaking point be. Certainly in the United States, people have even less of a sense of what that breaking point will be, and so there's a lot of intense interest around just how long this coalition can work, and what will be the specific pressure points that, if activated, will lead it to collapse. In terms of dynamics in Washington around Israel and Israeli-Palestinian issues generally, so we're seeing two things. One, we're seeing even more partisanization of anything related to Israel between Republicans and Democrats, and the consulate is actually a really good example where 6 months ago, 8 months ago, the consulate was on people's radars. I know that I've certainly been writing about it for a while, but it was kind of a lower key thing. It was the sort of thing where people assumed that the administration was going to do it relatively quickly after entering office, and some people who were very keyed in were paying attention, but for the most part, it was kind of a low radar issue here. And it's been elevated to now this very high profile issue where you have a letter where I think every single House Republican has signed on, requesting that the administration not reopen the consulate in Jerusalem, and you have Democrats who are making it also a very high profile issue and saying that it has to be done as a signal of U.S. commitments, not only in terms of campaign promises, but a U.S. commitment to resetting the relationship with the Palestinians. And you also have a Senate bill that I think at the moment has 37 Republicans on it. The same thing that would, not a letter, an actual bill that would bar the U.S. from reopening the consulate in Jerusalem. And so, and you see almost a perfect Republican-Democratic split on this. There is some overlap with some Democrats who are, I think, sympathetic to the position that the consulate, should not be reopened in Jerusalem. But something that in the wider context of U.S.-Israel relations shouldn't be a big deal in either direction, right? Reopening a secondary diplomatic facility that had existed until 3 years ago, but it's taken on this, these huge dimensions. And within just intra-democratic circles, we're seeing a real divide on what is the best way to get Israeli policy to shift. So whereas a few years ago within democratic circles, you had 6 or 7 kind of squad plus members who had one position, and then there were degrees of difference within the rest of the Democratic caucus, where there were some people who were more hawkish on some things, and some people who were less, and some people who wanted to push the Israelis more and some less. But you were able to get 190, 200 Democrats to sort of agree on a wide set of principles. And now we're seeing that split even more, where you now have a larger group of Democrats who are not where the squad are, but who want to start talking about use restrictions on security assistance to Israel, who want to push harder on settlement issues in particular. So, you're seeing that split, and we're starting to see it in congressional legislation, proposed congressional legislation on the Democratic side. That's kind of making this split a little more visible. And I think that from the Biden administration's perspective, because they don't want to really deal with any of these issues at the moment in a real way, they're sort of not engaging as much, in these intra-Democratic Party fights and within the congressional split over this. And so I think, and that contributes to it in a way as well, because whereas I think in previous administrations, congressional Democrats, wherever they are on this, would take cues from the administration, develop their own policy, but sort of take cues from where the administration is going. At the moment, there's more of a vacuum when it comes to the administration on this. And so, you see members of Congress kind of agitating and on their own trying to figure out not just how and whether to push the Israeli government, but how and whether to push the Biden administration on certain issues. And I think that there's just not a lot of clarity, even within Congress, on how to do this and what the administration actually wants and what the administration is actually going to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of kind of putting that succinctly. Lahav, I'm curious if you have any sort of responses or reactions from the Israeli perspective of the dynamics happening in Washington. I mean, how do Israelis look at the conversations happening over here? And I say that because the idea of two states, can we hear me? Did you lose me for a moment? Sorry. Increasing the idea of two states seems to be spoken about certainly in American circles, but it seems absent from the Israeli political discourse. I wonder if you can speak a bit about the concept of two states in today's Israeli political discourse and how Israelis are viewing the discourse in Washington from afar.
Yeah, I think when you talk about being absent from the political discourse, I think you're right. I mean, overall, right now, Israel's primary concern is both Israelis and the politicians is domestic issues, which I think is actually true for the U.S. right now as well. But in Israel, I think it's like more so than usual. And the political fighting is not so much about this, and it's not just the current political fight. For years now, the amount of Knesset members who are really focused on two states is very small. Right? Labor and Meretz are very small parties right now, and they're the ones focused on it. I mean, Lapid's party and Gantz's party ostensibly also support a two-state solution, but it's just like not up there on their priorities. They both think that, it's not going to happen anytime soon anyway. And then, you have Likud, Yamina, New Hope that oppose it. The Arab parties, of course, also support a two-state solution and do talk about it. But overall, it's just not like a big topic of conversation. When you look at polls, it's like around 50-50. There's like maybe a slight majority supporting a two-state solution, and a lot depends on sort of how you ask the poll questions. Like a lot of times they'll give details about what a two-state solution means, and so that sort of skews the answers in different ways. But even though a slight majority of Israelis support it, it's if you were to ask them how high it is on their list of priorities right now, it's just not up there. Looking at what's going on in the US, I think for most Israelis, they just say, okay, Biden is like a typical American president who wants, two states. But we're doing our, there's no partner. That's like the phrase people say in Israel all the time. There's no partner. And so we just have to do what we have to do. And then there's, of course, just like in the American media, in the Israeli media, there's sort of a disproportionate focus on the squad and like alarmism about the squad, I would say. And the fact that there was sort of a delay in funding for the Iron Dome got a lot more attention than the fact that, 420 in favor to 9 opposed funding the Iron Dome. That number didn't get, I think, as much attention as the drama preceding it. So that's where the conversation is here, I would say.
So I don't mean to raise a competing publication, but on our podcast earlier today, we had Amos Harel who mentioned that it appears that the Biden administration is only interested in the 3 C's, which I thought was clever, which was China, COVID, and climate change. And it strikes me that, maybe there's another C that could bring in this whole conversation, and that's a C of crisis. So I'm wondering, Michael, what are the flashpoints that we might be thinking that could be bringing this back to the fore? Perhaps I'd ask this to both of you. Maybe actually, Michael, before I go to you, I'll go right back to Lahav. Do you see there anything on the horizon that could serve to put this back on the front burner that we should be paying particularly close attention to? Michael mentioned the consulate, and I'd be curious your take on that as well. But what further could there be in terms of hot button issues that could bring this to the fore? And then I'll ask Michael as well.
Like, I think that there's always a real danger, not to be too morbid, but there's a danger that Mahmoud Abbas could die, which is something that I think is maybe not talked about enough, that we don't know who would succeed him. And I think that could be a huge...
Yeah, it's the only certainty in the Middle East, right? That he can't live forever.
Right. So I think that'll be very destabilizing. And as it stands, the Palestinian Authority is facing like a fiscal crisis. I had mentioned the donors conference that's happening today. In the past, when the Palestinian Authority was in it, the Palestinian Authority is the biggest employer of Palestinians. I think it's like 30% or something of employed Palestinians work for the Palestinian Authority. So if they're unable to pay salaries, that's often a hugely destabilizing factor. And in 2016, there was a wave of violence when there was a teacher's strike because the teachers weren't being paid. So those are sorts of things that could spark violence. And when the violence is coming from the West Bank, I think that the concern is even bigger than when it's coming from Gaza, that it could become like a real tinderbox and really require involvement. And that's when people start talking about a 2-state solution, when the problems in the West Bank aren't, over there behind those hills that, most Israelis never go to. When the problem starts coming to us, that's when Israelis care about it more.
So Michael, sorry.
No, and then I think, that it will probably come to a head with Washington as well.
Right. So Michael, I'm curious your take on that as well. What are some of the hot button issues that you're looking out for? And I wonder, just following up on your comments about sort of the efforts made by various Democratic legislators to fill the vacuum of an administration that hasn't engaged as much, what is the impact on some of those legislative initiatives, like you mentioned, that aim to not only restore the consulate, but have issues like end-use restrictions, particularly the new bill promoted by Andy Levin. How do you think that impacts the administration and its priorities, if at all?
On the first question about crises, again, a broken record here. I agree with Lahav. David, you and I talk all the time about what'll happen. What'll happen kind of in the post-Abbas period, and if anything happens to Abbas, or if the PA collapses because of financial reasons or otherwise, I think then that will bring this issue roaring back to the fore, not only for the United States, but for the Israeli government, because we in all sorts of ways the Israeli government depends on continued PA sovereignty in the West Bank. Which allows, frankly, the Israeli government to not worry about a lot of issues that it would otherwise have to worry about. And then, we saw in May with rockets from Hamas rockets from Gaza, that all of a sudden put the U.S. Into the conversation as well, with Tony Blinken traveling to the region, and one of the things we saw there was that the U.S. obviously was involved. But the U.S. was also really dependent on Egypt in particular to end the fighting and to make sure that any agreement held. And so, I think that it's sort of a good indication of where the Biden administration was, and I think probably still is, which is it will get involved if it has to, but it doesn't want to do so in a really deep way. And I think that it wants to focus on, not on crises and not on giant paradigm shifting solutions. I think it wants to focus on smaller things where things that can move the ball. And certainly, a crisis such as PA collapse, will change that necessarily. But I think it's going to take a lot for the U.S. To get drawn into this in ways that it doesn't want to get drawn in. I'd add one more thing on top of that, I guess, which isn't related to two states, but if there is an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities at any point over the next couple of years, and if that happens, it will certainly have downstream effects. And I think, it's probably safe to predict that if that happens, it'll ignite a front on Israel's northern front with Lebanon. If that happens, then there too, the U.S. is going to have to be involved in a big way, whether it wants to or not. On the question of how legislation in Congress impacts the administration's priorities or views or actions, so far not a lot. I mean, there is stuff in the two-state bill that was introduced by Congressman Andy Levin that we know the Biden administration does not support. The administration has been pretty clear that it doesn't support either conditioning or further end use restrictions. And the Two-State Act does create further end use restrictions on U.S. security assistance to Israel. The Biden administration has also, so far, not done things to reverse Trump administration policy that the bill calls for. For instance, restoring labeling guidelines on West Bank products, or restoring the old State Department guidance that had been in place since the 70s that the Trump administration changed on whether Israeli settlements are inconsistent with international law. And I'm not sure that the fact the administration hasn't done those things is a signal of its views. I think that, if you were to ask Biden administration folks, they probably would agree with the statement that settlements are inconsistent with international law. And I think that they'd probably also agree with the statement that that goods made in settlements should say product of the West Bank as opposed to product of Israel. But they also don't want to get bogged down in these types of fights, right? Because even changing something like that, which again, in the larger scheme of things is not a big deal, it will ignite all sorts of political fights. And so they've largely stayed silent. And so, what I said before about the vacuum being filled by congressional legislation, which is not going to pass, whether you're sympathetic to what's in the Two-State Act or not, the votes for it, do not exist, and it's not even close. But what it will do, I think, is make sure that the debate within the Democratic Party about how to deal with these issues, will continue, and probably the volume will continue to get turned up on it, irrespective of whether it actually has impact on U.S. policy or actual legislation that gets passed, or even the way the Biden administration thinks about or approaches these issues.
So I want to go to some of the questions from the audience. And Lahav, I want to start with you with sort of two of these questions from the audience. We'll do one at a time. But Jerry Fenning was asking about the three kind of top line goals and priorities of the current Israeli government, and how does the U.S. Fit into what those goals might be. I wonder if you'd take that, but particularly I'd be interested in what does this government seek to accomplish now that the budget is passed? What do you see as sort of the top priorities of the Israeli government right now? And is there a U.S. role in any of those, or are those top line priorities all domestic politics priorities that actually don't require any U.S. engagement?
I think they are really all domestic priorities because they don't want to step on things that are really controversial. Similar to the U.S., infrastructure is a big thing for this government right now. Some somehow it seems that traffic has gotten worse than it was before the pandemic. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but there's a lot of talk about, building new roads, better public transportation. There's work now on the Tel Aviv light rail, and even talk about the legendary Tel Aviv subway that for decades has never actually been built.
Right.
So that's like a big thing that people are not angry about, although we'll see what happens when their businesses have construction for a light rail in front of them. But they're not controversial, and they're talking about it a lot. Climate change is a lot less controversial in Israel than in the US. So they, with COP26, like they were all talking about that a lot. It's less controversial in Israel, by the way, just because it's like people, it just wasn't a big topic in Israel. And now this government is actually putting it into the headlines sort of intentionally, because it's something they can do that people aren't fighting over. There's religion and state issues, which are normally very difficult politically, but right now the Orthodox parties are not in the coalition. And so it's not going to be huge and revolutionary, but there are some, I guess, incremental changes. Somebody's commenting on climate change. Well, it's not that Israel doesn't have problems with climate change. I mean, Israel is in a hot spot, is in a danger zone for climate change. It's just that it's not a politically controversial issue.
Or even more so. Earlier today, you had the announcement of a deal between Israel, UAE, and Jordan on a solar deal, which actually shows the promise of some of the normalization. And
for sure. I think it's a great sign of where the normalization is going. Just to, if anyone isn't like up to date on today's news, the deal is that Israel will open a desalination plant that is designated for Jordan, and Jordan will buy water from Israel, and Jordan, which is not lacking in open desert spaces, will open a solar field that is designated for energy for Israel. And it was mediated by the US and the UAE. So that's, and that brings me to another thing where on foreign policy, there's definitely, I think, a big effort to turn the Abraham Accords into something that you could really see tangible benefits beyond, Israelis going on vacation in Dubai, so that, they can have a sort of foreign policy win. I think it's really interesting, for example, things that the US is involved in. I mean, we talked about why the two-state solution is not something that's being talked about a lot, but also Iran. Israelis overwhelmingly oppose the Iran deal, and so does this government overwhelmingly. But because there's not going to be a win there, and that the Biden administration it's listening to Israel but not doing what Israel wants, that they're taking the opposite tack of Netanyahu, who talked about it all the time. They're trying to minimize it as much as possible. And there's very little, there's discussion in the media for sure, but there's very little comment on it. So I mean, if we're talking about the priorities of this government, it's really not, it's not the kind of things that the US has to be involved in.
Just as a follow-up to that, Maytel Kowalski just wrote in a question about, given this current reality that it's not been on the radar for Israelis, what would need to happen for it to?
What's it?
Climate?
Oh, two-state solution. I was like, wait, what? What would need to happen?
What does it take to get that back on the radar for Israelis in a serious way?
I mean, it was sort of like what we were talking about before. I think it has to be a crisis. There's an unfortunate bug in the Israeli system where we're constantly putting out fires instead of planning for the long term, and it's not just when it comes to the Palestinians, but that comes up with the Palestinians as well. Where I don't think that this government intentionally is not dealing with it because they know that they don't agree and it could threaten the stability of this government. But even in the previous government, it was only getting dealt with when there were crises. It was just constantly putting out fires instead of planning ahead.
Mm-hmm. I just want to encourage the audience, if you do have a question, please throw it up into the Q&A section. I promise I'll get to you, Michael, but I want to hear Lahav's answer to this question from Richard Robbins, which is the question that I think we hear most often in most of the conversations we have these days, which is what would happen if Bibi were to leave the scene? What happens to the Israeli political scene? And do we anticipate Bibi leaving the scene at any moment in time?
Netanyahu doesn't look like he wants to leave the scene. I thought he would. I thought he would be sick of being opposition leader. And he doesn't look like he's particularly enjoying being opposition leader, but I think that he thinks that the minute this government falls, he can make a comeback. I mean, certainly the polls look good for him. That being said, if he does leave, I think there's going to be like a bloodbath in Likud. There's going to be a really, really messy primary. There's a good chance that Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, will win just because he has a lot of money to throw into the race. So if I had to bet on anyone, I'd bet on him, but there are other strong candidates in the party, including the only person who's actually said he's running, which is Yuli Edelstein, former refusnik and Speaker of the Knesset. That I do think, look, you never know, but the way the polls stand now, Likud is in the lead. I think Likud, and it's far in the lead. And I think Likud is far in the lead because of Netanyahu. I think that Likud won't do as well as someone else in the lead. But the weird situation with the Israeli system is that if somebody else is leading Likud, no matter what, there's a majority of right-wing votes in the Knesset. Like even right now, when you have this mishmash government, there are about 75 right-wing seats in the Knesset out of 120. So even though Netanyahu at the head of Likud would get more seats than anyone else at the head of Likud, any of those other people would be more likely to be able to form a right-wing coalition. So, there's so many what ifs and so many, variables here, but I would guess that if somebody else led Likud in the next election, that they would then be able to have a right-wing coalition that would have Naftali Bennett and Gidon Sar and maybe even Avigdor Lieberman in it.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I want to turn to you to talk a bit about the concept we haven't actually named, but there's been a lot of talk around the concept most attributed to Mika Goodman in his book Catch 67, around the notion of shrinking the conflict, and the idea that this notion of shrinking the conflict has been in some manner or form adopted by Naftali Bennett. And I wonder, Michael, if you could speak to what you might see as the opportunities or challenges with such a concept, and how do you, from the US perspective, how do you see this playing out thus far? You mentioned a bit about some positive, some negative steps, but I wonder, are there actual opportunities to reduce tensions? And if there are, what are some of the things the United States could be doing to encourage such steps?
There certainly are opportunities to reduce tensions, and I think we've seen a decent amount of it, coming directly through Benny Gantz rather than through Naftali Bennett. And I'll note that Benny Gantz also talks about his affinity for Micha Goodman. And we've seen when Gantz talks about strengthening the Palestinian Authority and not just going to meet with Abu Mazen, but floating the PA alone in the form of an advance on tax revenues, and not just housing permits, but increasing work permits, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So we've seen these types of initiatives, and they're all things that the United States has been supportive of. I think that where it has the potential to run into problems is that even in, leaving the United States aside, even in the Israeli context, there is a debate about what shrinking the conflict means. Naftali Bennett has openly spoken about it as effectively a form of economic peace. So you improve the economy in the West Bank and you improve the Palestinian Authority's economic situation, but you don't take any political steps. Whereas Micha Goodman himself has criticized Naftali Bennett for implying that shrinking the conflict is only about economic steps and that it doesn't involve political steps. Benny Gantz, I think, has been kind of cagier, which also seems to be his style, kind of fainting in one direction one day and another direction the next day. About whether he views this as something that ultimately has some sort of political end or not. I thought his comments about, or his reported comments about being the next Yitzhak Rabin were interesting in terms of how he views himself and how he positions himself. So I think that within the Israeli context, there's some debate about what it means. I think that within the American context, there's no doubt that the U.S. would like to see shrinking the conflict take more of a political tenor and not just be economic. And so whether that means giving the PA some more sovereignty over security issues in Area B than it currently has, or whether it even means giving the PA some sort of role in Area C or in parts of East Jerusalem. I think that the Biden folks would like to see shrinking the conflict have more of a political dimension than the Israeli government is probably willing to cede. And so, at the moment, it's served, I think, as a point of unity between the United States and Israel, and that everybody can embrace a basket of measures that we can term shrinking the conflict. But I do think that over time, the U.S. is likely to push the Israelis a bit and say, okay, great, there have been more work permits, there have been some housing permits approved. Kind of what are the next steps? And I think that at that point, the Israeli government is at least while Bennett is still prime minister, likely to say more of the same, and we'll see if that ends up causing friction with the U.S. or not. But I do think that there probably is a gap conceptually in what each side thinks shrinking the conflict means.
Right. So I know we're at time, but I thought there were two questions that came up, and I know there's some other questions we didn't get to. I just want to encourage those folks who asked those questions that I think some of those will be questions we'll really cover in some of the upcoming sessions that we'll do together. So I know we want to encourage everyone to come back. But Lahav, I can't let you go without addressing sort of a combination of two questions we received. And one is, is continuing West Bank settlement construction, this is again from Richard Robbins, saying that some people say building approved in the West Bank will be the death knell for a two-state solution. Do you agree? How likely is the government to move forward and implement these approvals? And we had another question about what about a three-state solution? And what about other alternatives to two states? And I wonder if you could address those kind of two questions in combination. Do you see some of these announcements really taking that option off the table? Or do you see any other formulations gaining any sort of traction among Israelis at all?
The announcements that are being made right now, they're all within existing settlements. And so I don't actually think that it threatens anything or makes a major change in that way. But overall, I think that the view on settlements and whether they're threatening a two-state solution or not has to do with how you see a two-state solution. I mean, there are 500,000 Israelis living in Judea and Samaria now, and it would be very hard for the Palestinians to have a contiguous state as it stands. The way the situation is right now. Now, could they have a state that's not contiguous? Could there be land swaps to make it contiguous? Maybe. I mean, the thing with the two-state solution is that there are a million different versions of what that would look like. So, I think that there are ways to, if a lot of people have kids in Efrat and you want to build apartments for those kids to live in, I don't think that's going to threaten the two-state solution. But, if you want to build a new town, or if you want to build in E1, which will basically cut off the Palestinians in Jerusalem from Palestinians in other parts of the West Bank, then that's, sort of more questionable if a two-state solution is your ultimate goal. As far as a three-state solution is concerned, I mean, if you want to give Hamas a state, okay. The third state would be Hamas. I don't think anybody wants to give them a state. De facto, they are pretty much separate from the Palestinian Authority, and that's a solution, that's a problem that's going to have to be dealt with if and when the problems more broadly are dealt with, right? So, right now, I think that they are sort of dealt with as a separate entity from the Palestinian Authority, just because Hamas, killed basically all the Fatah officials in Gaza and doesn't really allow the Palestinian Authority to be involved in any way in what's going on in Gaza. But would that be ideal for there to be ultimately a Hamas-run state? And I don't really see anyone who thinks that that's what it should be. so it's a difference between what in Hebrew, there's a really good expression for this, but it's a difference between what exists and what we want.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll just add, something you hear from Palestinians all the time is no Palestine without Gaza and no Gaza without Palestine, right? This idea that that you're not going to have a Palestinian state just in the West Bank, and that also Gaza on its own is not going to be the Palestinian state. And so I think it's while we may at the moment have a de facto three-state solution, given the Fatah-Hamas divide in the West Bank and Gaza, and given that we do have kind of these three territories in the land of Israel that are all under different forms of sovereignty in one way or another. For a three-state solution to work, it's not just something that the Israelis would have to agree to. You have to have the Palestinians themselves agree to that. And it's rare to find a Palestinian either in the Hamas camp or in the Fatah camp that's willing to embrace that idea. So I think it's not something we're going to see anytime soon.
Well, I think that's an excellent jumping off point for our next session. And first of all, let me thank Lahav and Michael, and of course, David, for providing such unique and well-articulated insights and analysis, and helping us to synthesize everything that's going on right now. The questions that we ended with specifically about the Palestinians and what's going on then are exactly the questions that we're going to address next session, which is in 2 weeks from today. We're going to take off next Wednesday, and we'll be back on December 1st. We'll be during Hanukkah, and we'll bring lots of light to the discussion on especially what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians, what's going on inside Palestinian society and the political arena there. The following week on the 8th, we'll be speaking specifically about Israeli and Palestinian civil society. We're talking about people-to-people programs and what's going on in the ground. Are there differences between what's happening on the streets and in the halls of the political echelon? And then some of the questions that came up also about normalization, the West Bank, settlements, borders, all of those questions are going to be addressed in the forthcoming session. So I do hope that you will join us. The recording will be available, and the same link is there to sign up for all 4 remaining sessions of the series. Again, my deep thanks to Israel Policy Forum, and I look forward to continued partnerships between URJ and IPF, and wishing everybody shalom, a happy Thanksgiving, and a Chanukah Sameach.
Thanks all. Thanks, Josh.